Hey, Anita here. We've entered into another new Hebrew month. I'm really excited to share with you what the Lord's been showing me by way of experience and through His Word related to this new season. Let's dive in. This is the 12th month. It's called Adar, which means strength. And as with every month, this month is associated with one of the tribes of Israel, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And this month is associated with Naphtali. So who was Naphtali? Well, we can read a little bit about his origin story in Genesis chapter 30. And Bilhah, Rachel's female servant, conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings with God, I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. Genesis 30, verse 7 and 8. So as you could probably tell, Naphtali means my wrestling. That's how he got his name. And in Hebrew, Naphtali comes from a Hebrew root word, pathal, which means to twist, be cunning, be difficult or contrary, to wrestle, full of twists and turns. So Rachel was saying she literally twisted herself with her sister. God was using these wrestlings, this competition and this envy that was happening between Jacob's two wives to deal with Jacob's natural disposition in order to transform him. That's what we're going to see in this story today. So naturally, with his name meaning wrestle, I was drawn to that word and figured there was going to be something about wrestle that we'd be talking about this month. But little did I know, God had a little secret for me. On the first day of this new month, I put the pieces together a little later, I woke up and could not walk. I injured my hip flexor at the gym doing some kind of straining stretch I shouldn't have been doing, I guess. A new stretch I hadn't tried before. And I couldn't lift my leg. I couldn't step up the step. I couldn't, bend down, pick up anything. It was really a bad deal. I was yelping out in pain and grabbing all the furniture to pull myself up. And it was quite an adventure for a few days. Thankfully, it got healed pretty quickly with a trip to the chiropractor and some ice. But what I noticed was that it was that little spot in my hip flexor, in the front of my leg on my hip, that does so many things I didn't realize, and I was amazed that little area could have so much to do with all of my movements. And it made me think about the story in Genesis. I knew that there was a story where Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord, this man or this heavenly wrestler. And in this all-night wrestling bout, at the end of the story, the angel touched the socket of Jacob's hip or his thigh and dislocated it somehow. And from then on, Jacob was walking with a limp. Well, this is a very strange story. I think people really haven't known what to do with it. I have always had a lot of questions about this story. And so I thought we could approach this video by kind of attacking some of those questions. And I really feel like that few Christians really have been digging around in this story and understand the significance of it. But I think it very much has to do with wrestle. And even the wrestling that was going on between Jacob's two wives and Naphtali being named wrestle, I think it's all connected. So let's dig in and see what we can find. So the question is, why now? Why, as Jacob's now finally returning with his whole family back to the land of his fathers, the land of Abraham and Isaac, the land that God promised, and he obeyed the voice of the Lord and returned. He picked up all of his family and they sojourned back from where they'd been living with Laban and his wife's homeland. And they're bringing everything with them and coming back. And they're at this point of transition when Jacob's going to have to confront his brother Esau, who he had deeply offended. And it was a desperate time for Jacob. He really didn't know if it was going to go well with Esau. And he was at this point of crossing over and in this point of desperation. And here we finally see Jacob praying for the very first time. Now, I'm not saying he didn't have encounters with the Lord before now, but this is a first record of a prayer we have from Jacob. And it's in chapter 32 of Genesis. And in verse 12, he prayed something that touched God's heart. he actually prayed according to God's purpose, and it was really good. What did he say? He said, "But you have said," Jacob said that to the Lord, "Lord, you have said, I will surely do you good and make your seed like the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered." See what he was doing there? You have said, and he's recounting the promises the Lord has already given regarding him and regarding his destiny and regarding this land. And God responded to this prayer. So why now? I think God was responding to this prayer that Jacob prayed in verse 12. And that night, after he prayed that prayer, Jacob, still struggling, still stressed and striving and figuring out how is he going to cope, was surprised as a man showed up and began to wrestle with him. Let's actually read this last part of Genesis 32, starting in verse 22. "And he rose up that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 children and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the stream and sent over what he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip. The socket of Jacob's hip was dislocated as he wrestled with him. And the man said, 'Let me go, for the dawn is breaking.' But Jacob said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' And he said to him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' And he said, 'Your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed.' And Jacob asked him and said, 'Please tell me your name.' And he said, 'Why is it that you ask my name?' And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for he said, 'I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved.' And the sun rose upon him as he crossed over Peniel, and he limped because of his hip. Therefore the children of Israel do not eat the thigh muscle, which is upon the socket of the hip to this day, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip at the thigh muscle." So, question, what is this strange story about? And I think to answer it, we need to get up to a high view and look at it from God's perspective. He was looking for a man to express him. He called Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob. He chose Jacob to express him. This is God's desire. We see it all the way back in Genesis chapter 1, where in verse 26 he said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And this is God's good pleasure. It's a mystery why, but God wants man to be filled with God and to express him. And that's true not only of Jacob, it's true of you. You've been chosen to express God. And in this story, we need to see that Jacob had a lot of rough edges. His name actually even means supplanter or heel grabber. And from birth, he was full of nothing. He was demonstrating nothing but self, flesh, and natural man. He was full of shrewdness and sharpness or cleverness. And he's a picture of all of us. We might not have the same personality or temperament as him, but we've all been born into Adam. And we all have these innate natural strengths in our own soul life. Like in our mind, we have certain strengths. In our will, we have certain strengths. And in our emotions, we have certain strengths that we bring to the table. And it makes us who we are. We were created in Adam with these strengths. But this naturalness has to be wrestled out of us. And that's what this story is about. God intends to wrestle with you, to perfect you, to have a man who will express him. And whenever we require a dealing, God knows the exact, precise dealing that we need. So as we desire to cross over and move more into our future destiny, we can look at this story of Jacob and see some key things. He had a big fear. He set his face to return to the land of his fathers and to the land of promise. But it wasn't an easy path for him. To do that, he had to confront Esau, his brother, who he had greatly offended and had to run from in fear of his own life. And Esau was coming out to meet him with 400 men. There was nothing Jacob could imagine that was good about that. He was afraid for his life, and he was conniving and moving family members around and trying to figure out how to protect and preserve everything that was his in the face of his brother coming. And he couldn't sleep in peace. His mind was actually working overtime to try to figure out a solution to his problem. Can you relate? When we want to cross over into our destiny, often we're struggling with these same kind of fears that seemingly are hounding us and descending down upon us and causing us to feel like we just can't make it over the threshold. I love this. If we look closely at Genesis 32, we see that there's no word that this man ever came or that this man ever left. He just was there, and then he appeared. I love that. It's just a picture of how God is always with us. So we know that Jacob, from the previous chapter 31, that he was really coming into a spiritual awakening of recognizing. It was like a landmark for him, and he was able to recognize and testify that he was under God's sovereign care. So as he's coming into this awareness, he's beginning to understand that he's under the secret care of the angel of God, the angel of Elohim, or the secret care of Christ. And we are too. Whether we know he's there or not, he is always with us, and he's walking with us through any and every fear that we face. And this is a month that we're going to face off some fears in order to advance, like Jacob had to face off Esau and his army of 400 men. And as we apply this to our life, we need to know that there's a wrestle for our future. Now's a good time to point out that both Dan and Naphtali's birth mom, her name was Bilhah, and her name actually means timid. Her name Bilhah comes from a verb balah, which means to trouble or terrify, to be feeble or modest. So we have to wrestle for our future, and we're going to have to face off some fears. And even the origin story of Naphtali contains this sense of fear or being troubled or terrified. And I think the Lord wants to say to us that it's time to cease striving and to recognize him. He's here. Perceive how he is working with you. So why do you think the angel of the Lord, this man, this heavenly wrestler, refused to tell Jacob his name when Jacob asked? I think the Lord, in his dealings with us, keeps himself secret. You know, we mostly think that situations we're in, difficult things we're dealing with, that those situations are because of another person. And we strive with that person to not be subdued. And we are going to end up on top. And we waste a lot of energy trying to subdue that other party or that other situation. You might stop for a minute and just think, what are some situations that you've encountered lately that are causing you pain? They're difficult. They just feel like a thorn in your side, and you wish you could get out of that situation. Maybe it's with a spouse or with an employer or a child. Something you're trapped in that you're dealing with, and you can't just make it go away. So you're trying to figure out how you're going to end up on top in that situation. We all have these all the time. And I don't think we don't stop and realize that the Lord is here. If you stop, you don't need to ask his name. You know the name of the one who's wrestling. He's wrestling with you. He's given you a situation that you can't control, and it's God wrestling with you. This is a good time for me to stop and tell you a personal story about my wrestle. Recently, my husband got interested in a new form of vacationing, something I wasn't comfortable with. I'm much more of a planner, and he has a spontaneity about him that he was wanting to explore. And the way of vacationing has to do with overland camping and sleeping in the back of our SUV in a bed. And I'm used to planning out what hotel we're going to go to, all the restaurants we're going to go to. So a vacation for me is very planned, and I'm relaxed once I know I have the plan. And this wasn't something I could plan. I didn't know where we were going to park, how we were going to get a shower. I mean, everything about it was unnerving to me. And every time he started talking about taking a trip, I was grumpy. And it was obvious I wasn't happy. And we went on like that for a few days, this wrestling match back and forth. And although I wasn't outwardly saying, no, I won't go, it was clear I wasn't happy. And I think that's partly just a difference between men and women, and differences between husbands and wives, difference between planners and ones who are more spontaneous. But, I feel like in that wrestle, the Lord wanted to really talk to me about this wrestle in the month of Naphtali. This is a time where we can really say yes to the Lord when he calls us to come up higher and to come away with him. And I heard the Lord's voice whispering through my husband's spontaneity and his fresh idea about vacationing. I heard the Lord saying, are you willing to say yes to me? Are you willing to come away with me? And it was at that point that I had a shift in my attitude when I realized it was the Lord who was inviting me on this new journey that was uncomfortable. And it was my opportunity to say yes to the Lord in my husband's invitation. And so I stopped trying to subdue him or control the situation or even figure out how to plan the entire situation. Although to his credit, he did allow me to do some planning and pick out a place for us to park ahead of time, which brought some comfort to me. So we worked together and we got the best blend of vacationing where there is some planning with some spontaneity. But my story just is to share that, in these wrestles with other people, if we can realize it's the Lord, he's here. What is he after in me? And if we can work to cease our striving and struggling and our wrestling and answer that question, it's really going to help go a long way towards our process of transformation. So you might be curious, how did the rest of the story turn out? And actually, it was quite comfortable. I slept well. I had a hot shower. I was happy. We had a great time. And I really feel like the Lord used all of that to teach me that he has my best interest at heart. And actually, I really feel like it did something to spark a fresh life in our marriage. And it opened up something in my husband's heart and in my heart towards him. And I just think that our love grew more. And as you're married for more years, I think it's important that you find fresh ways to engage one another. And I just wanted to share this story to say that wrestle was ugly for me in the beginning, but I'm really glad that I recognized it was the Lord. And as I did, the whole situation shifted into something quite positive. So another question is, why couldn't the angel of the Lord put Jacob down? I mean, why did he wait so long before touching the sinew of Jacob's thigh? Why not at the very beginning? And why did he tolerate that for so long? I think the answer to that is that the Lord, as this man, he persevered with Jacob. You know what? He's persevering with you too. Jacob needed transformation in his soul. And our soul life takes a long time to be exposed. So why couldn't he put him down? Well, of course he could put him down, but he was persevering with him. The angel of the Lord was persevering with Jacob to wrestle with him and to show him how natural he was. Do you see the difference? We have our overt sinful actions, but then there's also this natural soul life that we have. It's not overtly sinful. It's just our natural makeup or our natural disposition. Like in my story, I'm naturally a planner. That can be a positive thing or negative, depending on if I abuse other people with my need for planning. You see what I mean? So we have this natural makeup or disposition. And this persevering that the Lord does with us is to expose that. And that takes a long time to expose. Jacob, he persisted in this wrestling match. I mean, if you really think about this, from midnight until daybreak, Jacob was wrestling. That, for one thing, that's supernatural. I mean, just to wrestle for 1 minute, if you've ever done it, is extremely exhausting. And for him to wrestle that long, I think shows the strength of our natural man. We do not want to be subdued. And this angel of the Lord was coming to Jacob and saying, Jacob, lie down, be quiet, sit down. And the Lord is coming to do that to us. In his love, he's persevering with us to get our soul life to sit down. Do you know that God in his sovereignty is arranging, he's tailor-making these wrestlings for you? Each and every aspect of your environment, tailor-made for what you need, for God to carry out his work of transformation in you. You know, it takes a long amount of trouble for most of us to see what hasn't yet been transformed. But your spouse or your child or your boss is being used by the Lord to subdue you. And you may be exercising your strength to defeat them, but may God's light shine on us right now that we would see, for years I've been wrestling with this boss or this husband or this wife for years, but now I see it's you, Lord. Another question is, at the end of this story in Genesis 32, after a full night of wrestling, why did the angel of the Lord then ask Jacob to say his name? He already knew Jacob's name. It was to cause Jacob to realize who he was and to force him to admit that in his natural man, he was Jacob, the crafty supplanter. Supplanter in the Bible means to usurp the place of, especially through intrigue or underhanded tactics. Jacob was a heel grabber. Do you see yourself in Jacob's history? You have God's calling and God's promise, yet you spend a lot of time and energy exercising your soul. If you really stop and think about your experience, how often do you feel like you have your destiny and you are going to go at it by any means necessary? You're going to grab life by its horns. You're going to grab for your destiny, and you're going to use all the natural strength within yourself that you can employ to get that destiny. That's what Jacob was doing, and that's what God was trying to expose. Jacob had God's calling, and he had God's destiny. But when we try to grab at it, and if you think about your own story, how many times did those attempts actually just end up being futility and vanity? Because God's not going to allow us to get our destiny by that. He's going to bring us into our destiny and into our calling. So as we cross over, we need to remember that this wrestling we're experiencing, we have an opportunity to sit down, to cease striving, and recognize that God is in control, and he's wanting us to just name that part of ourself that's trying to grab at those things and just identify it, like Jacob had to say his name. So Jacob had a name change at this point. At dawn here, when the light of day comes into the scene and Jacob says his name, he acknowledges that he's a crafty supplanter, Jacob. Then the heavenly wrestler says in verse 32, Genesis 32:28, your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled or wrestled with God and with men and have prevailed. This is a mystery, but this name Israel does mean Prince of God. You may have heard Israel translated that way. But the best translations do show that this meaning is secondary. That actually the primary meaning of Israel is wrestler with God. Israel's name comes from a combination of Sarah and El. Sarah means to persist, to exert oneself, to persevere, to strive, to contend. In verses 30 and 31, we read, and Jacob called the name of the place Penuel, for he said, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved. And the sun rose upon him as he crossed over Penuel. and he limped because of his hip. I love this. Now Jacob was under the shining of the heavenly light. No one under God's light remains whole. Under God's light, we're lame. This is difficult to accept, and we fight against it, but Lord, shine your light on us. Lord, I just pray right now that in our many wrestlings, which are really wrestlings with you, that our natural soul life would be touched, and that you would shine your light on us, that we could receive and then perceive your many touches until we're transformed into limping ones who are leaning on our beloved. So we have a couple of important takeaways from this story, some things that we can apply to our own lives spiritually. And I think the first one is that we see that after this story, that actually Jacob still hadn't changed very much, apparently. But actually, in terms of life, he had experienced a great change, because now everything he did with a limp. So we want to cry out for his touch this month. The Lord's touch is what we need. And if we really want God to help us with our soul life, we need his touch. We try to apply religion in the form of a list of rules and regulations to try to deal with our behavior. But I think what God wants to grow in you is more like a life garden. As a way of illustration, can you imagine with me that you work at a flower shop and you make and you sell both imitation and real flowers? Think about it. If you have all the supplies you need, how many imitation flowers can you make, like start and finish in one day? Imitation is quick, but compare that to real, organic flowers. Flowers that you have to grow from the seed. They sprout into a seedling, and then you watch them slowly bloom from seedling into a full blossom in all of its glory. How many of those can you make in one day? Religion is quick and easy, and you can form a whole army of imitators, like a whole army of imitation flowers in one day, by just applying a bunch of outward rules and regulations to try to conform people to a set of standards. But God is growing a life garden in you. And your growth in life, it takes time. God wasn't intimidated by the fact that Jacob didn't change overnight after this wrestling match. It's a process. God had been wrestling Jacob all along his whole life. And this was just one more step. And Jacob was slowly transforming. But we really don't see his full maturity for quite a few more chapters in Genesis. Growth in life takes time. And regarding the way of life versus the way of religion, you can think about it like the two trees. We have the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you can be eating from either tree at any time. When we're behaving badly, we know it's hard for the Lord to work himself into us. I'm actually learning it's more difficult for the Lord to work himself into me when I think I'm so good. And as we apply these lists of rules to quickly deal with our issues, we're actually eating from the wrong tree. We eat here every time we rely more on our learning or on our spiritual discipline than on relying on engaging our spirit to know, to love, and to continue to receive Christ as our life. That's what it's like to eat the tree of life. Remember, Jacob was touched in the sinew, the strongest part of his thigh. It's the part that you believe that's strongest in you that God intends to touch, so you'll not be trusting in your strength. It's not by our natural strength or our goodness that we express God. Did you know that? This actually leads us into a realm of boasting and what we've actually attained outwardly. In Psalm 147, verse 10 says, "He takes no delight in the strength of horses, nor pleasure in the legs of man." So God intends to touch the strongest part of you so that you won't trust in your own strength, your own natural strength, or your own natural goodness. And this is a really hard lesson for us to learn. but we're not going to express God through these means. And the last big takeaway follows on the heels of the first, and it's the answer to it. We need to trust and rest in Christ. We really need to sit down and cease our striving. You know, if we look to God, He's full of loving kindness and faithfulness. We could call upon Him and enjoy Christ. You know, you can make it your practice to express your love towards Him and just say, Lord Jesus, I love you. And you'll find His presence coming and filling your atmosphere. You get an opportunity then to be satisfied with Him. And He gets an opportunity to be satisfied with you as you eat and drink Him. And you experience relating to Christ as grace and reality. Then you'll be led by His Spirit into all the good things He has planned for you. This is the answer to standing and relying on our own natural strength and energy to fulfill our destinies versus trusting and resting in Christ and sitting down, recognizing when God is the one who's wrestling with us in our situations. As you rest in Him, you're going to have to ignore all that baggage that lingers behind you and all the fears that are lying ahead of you. You have to learn to just ignore them. And you'll discover that most all the things that you're worried about really do come to nothing. So don't care about the opposition. Don't care about the rumors. Just laugh at them. Many times the ones who we were afraid of actually become our helpers. You know, this really happened in Jacob's story, the dreaded meeting with Esau and his 400 men. They actually had a really loving encounter, and Esau offered to use all the strength of all those 400 men to help carry the things that were in Jacob's entourage. I love that. The things that we were afraid of actually become our helpers. You know, as His chosen ones, as long as we're on the way, and Jacob was on the way, and as we are on the way to God's goal, on the way to God's promise, everything is going to be all right. And we really can trust in His sovereign care to watch over all that concerns us. Romans 8:28 and 29 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Because those whom He foreknew, He also predestinated to be what? To be conformed to the image of His Son." That's God's good purpose for you. And He's going to work all things together for good to that end of that purpose, to conform you to the image of His Son. That's what this wrestling is all about. So to sum it all up, God had to wrestle with Jacob to get a man to express Him. And God is wrestling with us too. God is after certain crucial points of our perceived strengths. So we need to be touched by Him, exposed, so that we become His people who are trusting in Him, leaning on Him, and living by the divine life, so that we can be transformed, so that we can adequately express Him for His purpose. In this 12th month, called Adar, aka strength, remember, our God-produced strength of life and spirit is connected to the wrestling tribe of Naphtali. Thanks for watching. There's lots more to come. Consider subscribing to be notified of any future videos, and we'll see you next time.